The morning light had barely touched the sky when the mother slipped quietly out of the small, crumbling room she called home. Inside, her son lay wrapped in a thin blanket, his small chest rising and falling in the rhythm of sleep, his face turned toward the cracked wall where faint morning shadows danced. She paused for a moment at the doorway, taking in the sight of him, the only reason she had endured all these years of quiet battle. The room was little more than a box, damp and cold, with peeling paint and the faint smell of mildew that no amount of scrubbing could erase. Still, it was theirs, and for that she clung to a thin thread of gratitude. Her feet hit the pavement long before the city awakened. She moved briskly, knowing the clock was always against her. 3 houses waited, 3 employers who barely acknowledged her presence beyond curt instructions, and a folded bill left on the table. Her hands worked tirelessly through the hours, scrubbing kitchen tiles, sweeping polished floors, folding clothes that smelled of lavender and ease. Her own clothes clung damp to her back, thin fabric worn soft from countless washes. And though her feet ached with every step, she kept moving because stillness was a luxury she could no longer afford. Between tasks, she caught herself glancing at the small clock on her employer's wall, calculating how many hours remained until she could return home. Her mind wandered often to her son, to his eager face pressed to the window, waiting for her return, to the way he would run into her arms, his tiny fingers clutching her waist as if to anchor her to the world. By the time she left the last house, dusk was already threatening the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. In her pocket, the earnings of the day weighed heavy in coins and crumpled notes, barely enough, but just enough. At the small market, she selected each item with the precision of someone who understood the language of scarcity all too well. Rice, beans, a few eggs, and a loaf of bread, perhaps enough to stretch over the next few days if she rationed carefully. Her fingers trembled slightly as she counted the bills, pressing them into the cashier's palm with a soft "thank you" before gathering the bags into her aching arms. The walk home stretched longer than usual under the weight of exhaustion and the relentless heat that clung to the evening air. Each step felt like walking through a thick fog, her muscles stiff and unresponsive. She could feel her body warning her, the dizzy lightness in her head, the dryness at the back of her throat, the way her heart thudded unevenly in her chest. Still, she pushed forward, murmuring under her breath, just a little further, just a little more, imagining her son's face when she walked through the door. The groceries cut into her fingers, plastic handles biting into skin already raw from the day's labor. The sun hung low, casting a burnt orange hue over the street, the asphalt shimmering in the lingering heat. She barely noticed the people. Around her, the hurried footsteps, the distant laughter, the snippets of conversations she no longer had the energy to decipher. The world moved past her in blurs of sound and color, but her focus stayed on the imagined warmth of home. She was so close now, just a few more streets, just a few more blocks. She repeated it like a quiet prayer, a whisper meant for no one but herself. Her breath came in shallow gasps, a thin rasp that rattled in her chest. She stumbled once, then twice, and still she kept going, blinking hard against the spots of light that danced before her eyes. In a fleeting moment of clarity, she felt the sharp sting of hunger cutting through her belly, remembered she had not eaten since the night before, remembered how she had handed the last of the bread to her son that morning with a smile that concealed her own gnawing emptiness. She pressed a hand to her side, trying to steady herself, feeling the tremble of her own body, the faint quiver in her knees. The thought of stopping, of resting, crossed her mind like a faint echo, but she dismissed it almost instantly. Rest was something she would do at home, with her son in her arms, after the dinner was made, after the groceries were safely put away, after the long exhale of survival had passed through her lungs. But survival has its limits. She felt the world tilt slightly under her feet, the sounds around her folding inward, as if heard through a tunnel. She focused hard on the pavement ahead, on the shape of her own shadow, stretched long and thin by the dying light, but the edges blurred and wavered. For one brief, stubborn heartbeat, she willed herself to take another step, but her body answered with betrayal. As her knees buckled, as the bag slipped from her grasp, as the rice scattered across the ground and the eggs cracked open against the unforgiving concrete, a single thought rose sharp and desperate in her mind. I have to get home. And then the world went silent. The sound of the world faded into a dull hum as her body crumpled to the ground, the groceries splitting open beside her like fragile promises undone. The eggs oozed onto the pavement, the rice scattered in a soft, defeated whisper, and the loaf of bread rolled just beyond her reach, its plastic wrapping catching the last orange light of day. Her arms, once so determined, now lay limp by her sides, her fingers twitching faintly as though still trying to grasp what had slipped away. Her face pressed against the warm concrete, and for a moment she hovered at the edge of consciousness, caught between the noise of the street and the sudden quiet inside her own body. Around her the city pulsed on, relentless and indifferent. People passed, their steps brisk, their eyes darting briefly toward the figure on the ground before sliding away. A man in a suit glanced over his shoulder as he walked by, his brow furrowing for a split second before he pulled his phone from his pocket and moved on. A woman pushing a stroller crossed to the other side of the street, murmuring softly to the child nestled under a pink blanket, her eyes never quite meeting the scene unfolding only feet away. Teenagers with headphones in their ears, delivery drivers with heavy bags slung over their backs, couples lost in conversation, all moved past her as if she were another part of the city's rough and broken pavement, another obstacle to navigate around. The heat of the day clung to the concrete, pressing against her skin, seeping into the fabric of her clothes. She could hear fragments of life passing by, the snatch of a conversation, the jingle of a bicycle bell, the distant rumble of traffic, but they all seemed to come from another world, a place just out of reach. Inside her chest, her heart fluttered. Weakly, a bird beating its wings against a closing cage. She tried to open her eyes, but the weight of her own exhaustion pinned them shut. Somewhere, far away, she thought she heard the faintest echo of her son's voice, the sound of him calling to her, his small hands reaching, his face pressed to the window where he always waited. Minutes stretched thin and shapeless, marked only by the shifting patterns of footsteps around her. A shadow lingered at her side, hesitating, then moved on. Another hovered, a murmur of voices passing overhead, the click of a phone camera capturing the scene before fading into the distance. No one knelt. No one reached out a hand. No one spoke her name or asked if she was all right. In this city of millions, she was a quiet collapse on a busy street, a story written in bruises and exhaustion, a mother who had given everything until there was nothing left to give. And still, in the deep quiet of her mind, a single thought burned steady and fierce. I need to get home. The memory of her son's face, the sound of his laughter, the warmth of his arms wrapped around her waist. That was the anchor pulling her back from the edge. She willed her fingers to move, her arms to lift, her body to rise. But all that came was a faint shiver, a whisper of movement that barely stirred the dust on the pavement. Her breath rasped shallow in her throat, each inhale a battle, each exhale a surrender. As the sky darkened, the streetlights flickered to life, casting long pools of light onto the sidewalks. The rhythm of the city slowed only slightly, a shift from daylight urgency to nighttime drift, but the current of indifference remained unchanged. A small group of teenagers passed by, their laughter bright and careless, their eyes sliding briefly toward the figure on the ground before bouncing away like stones skipping across water. A delivery worker swerved around her, glancing down just long enough to step clear of the scattered groceries. Across the street, behind a glass window, a woman paused from her dinner to watch, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth, her eyes wide. with something between concern and detachment before she turned back to her companion. The mother lay there, wrapped in the silence of 1,000 passing lives, the coolness of the night beginning to settle over her skin. In the space between breaths, she held on to the image of home, to the sound of a small voice calling for her in the dark, to the promise she had made to herself so many times before, just a little more, just a little further, just a little longer. And in that fragile, flickering space where the world moved on and left her behind, she waited for her body to remember how to rise. She didn't remember hitting the ground. What she remembered was the heat, the spinning sky, the sting of sun behind her eyelids. And then, nothing. Not the moment her knees gave in, not the bag slipping from her hands, not the dull thud of her body against concrete. Just the silence afterward. When she opened her eyes again, the streetlight above her buzzed faintly, casting her shadow long and strange across the sidewalk. The world had gone on. There was no crowd gathered around her, no hand lifting her gently, just a faint soreness in her ribs and the mess of food spilled around her, mocking all the effort of her day. Her head throbbed as she tried to move, every inch of her body aching like she'd run for miles. A sharp sting shot through her hip where she'd landed hardest. Her lips were cracked, and when she tried to lick them, her tongue was dry and swollen. The sounds around her came in slow, distant waves. Cars, voices, footsteps, none of them meant for her. She was part of the scenery now, something between the curb and the gutter, something the city had learned to walk around. She turned her head and saw the broken eggs oozing their yolk into the dust. The loaf of bread had been stepped on, flattened and torn. The beans had rolled into the gutter, their metal can dented from impact. One of the bags had been picked apart by wind and footsteps, and now it flapped against the sidewalk like a discarded flag. She closed her eyes again, not out of pain, but because seeing everything she had worked for, scattered and ruined, hurt in a way her body could not match. Somewhere inside her, there was a rising panic, not for herself, not for the pain, but for the boy who would be waiting, the boy who would be hungry, the boy who would not understand why his mother had not come home yet. He would sit by the door, watching the outside grow darker, wondering why she was late. He would try to be brave because that's what she always asked of him, but the truth was, he was still so small, still soft and full of hope, and it tore at her to think of that hope wilting in the dark. She pressed her palms to the ground and tried to push herself up, but her arms buckled. Her body felt far away, like something borrowed and nearly broken. Her vision blurred again, and this time, it wasn't from the heat. It was from the weight of it all, the quiet knowledge that no one had stopped. Not when she fell, not when she lay there helpless, not even as her groceries lay scattered like roadkill around her. They had looked, they had seen, but they had kept walking. A woman had slowed down, she remembered, had looked straight at her from a few steps away, but she had tightened her grip on her purse and crossed the street. A man had walked by, talking loudly on his phone, and without missing a word, he stepped over the crushed bread. One pair of feet had paused near her, hesitated, and then kept going. She wasn't angry. She didn't have room for anger anymore, only this aching, quiet grief. The kind that doesn't scream or shout, it just settles in your bones and stays there. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time didn't feel real anymore. Her body was drenched in sweat, the kind that turns cold once the sun goes down. Her clothes clung to her, damp and dirty. She had nothing left but her hands and whatever strength still lived in them. So she tried again, one elbow pressed against the ground, then the other. Her knees under her, her breath burning in her throat. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't fast, but she got upright. Standing was a different war altogether. The dizziness rushed back, and the edges of the world wobbled. She had to lean against a wall to keep from collapsing again. She looked down at the bags, torn, half empty, a mess of groceries that no longer mattered to anyone but her. and she bent down, slow and shaking, to gather what she could. She didn't think about the dirt, the cracks in the eggshells, the grit clinging to the bread. All she could think was, I have to bring him something. Anything. When she finally took a step, it was with a limp. Her ankle protested with each movement. Her shoulders sagged under the weight of plastic handles, now tied into knots to hold what little remained. She walked slowly, not just from pain, but from the realization that no one was coming. There was no miracle around the corner, no kind stranger pulling over, no door swinging open with a flood of concern. There was only this broken walk forward, one heavy step at a time, through a city that didn't even notice she had fallen. She didn't cry. She hadn't in years, not because she hadn't wanted to, but because crying had never changed anything. It didn't put food on the table. It didn't pay rent. It didn't make people care. So she swallowed it like she had swallowed every other ache, and she walked. Not because she was strong, not because she was brave, but because there was no other option. Because somewhere, not far now, her son was waiting. And even if she arrived with nothing in her hands, even if all she brought home was a bruised body and a quiet apology, he would look at her with the same eyes. The ones that still believed she could do anything. The ones that hadn't yet learned how invisible she really was. The streets grew darker as she moved, the lamps casting a pale yellow glow on uneven sidewalks, the air thick with the smell of exhaust and the faint aroma of food drifting from windows she would never enter. Each step pulled at something deep inside her, a small, splintering pain that traveled up her legs and into her back, settling between her shoulders like a stone. She held the knotted bags tight against her chest, her fingers trembling from strain and cold, her arms wrapped not around groceries anymore, but around the last pieces of her own endurance. The city around her had begun to thin, the hurried footsteps. Fewer, the laughter behind closed doors, the sound of televisions muffled behind walls. She passed lit windows where families gathered over dinner, where parents called their children to the table, where plates clinked and voices softened into the warmth of home. And still she walked, a lone figure beneath the high-rise shadows, unnoticed, unneeded, unseen. Every few steps she stumbled, catching herself with a hand against a grimy wall or a rusted street pole, pausing just long enough to steady her breath before pushing forward again. The distance that separated her from home, which in the morning had seemed routine, now stretched into something monstrous. Her mind drifted in and out of focus, flashes of her son's face filling the empty spaces between each breath. She imagined him sitting on the floor, playing with a battered toy truck, pausing every few minutes to look toward the door. She saw him pressing his face against the window pane, his small palms leaving foggy circles on the glass as he watched the night swallow the street. She imagined the slight droop of his shoulders when the clock ticked past the time she normally came home, the way he would draw his knees to his chest, telling himself that Mama was just late, that Mama was always late. But Mama always came. Home. Her chest tightened at the thought. It was not just exhaustion or hunger now. It was something deeper. A cracking at the center of her being, the quiet fracture of a body pushed beyond its limit. She tried to lift her foot onto the next step, but faltered, nearly toppling into the street. A car rushed past, its headlights catching the panic in her eyes, but it never slowed, never paused. She pressed her back to the cold brick wall and slid down slowly, feeling her knees give way, her fingers still clutching the bags even as her arms sagged to the ground. For the first time in years, she felt the sting of helplessness rise sharp in her throat. She wanted to cry out, to call for someone, anyone, but when she opened her mouth, no sound came. Her voice had been worn thin by years of silence, by days spent swallowing every need, every complaint, every plea. She sat there, folded in on herself, the night creeping over her like a heavy blanket, her body shivering from the chill that came when sweat turned cold against skin. A couple passed on the opposite side of the street, their laughter light and quick, arms linked, Heads tilted toward each other, they glanced briefly in her direction, eyes sliding over her hunched figure without pausing, their footsteps quickening slightly as they moved past. She watched them, the shape of their backs, retreating into the dark, and felt something inside her shift. Not resentment, not anger, only a deep, hollow ache, a bone-deep knowing that she had become part of the landscape, something expected, something ordinary, something that could be ignored. Her fingers went numb around the plastic handles. Her head dipped forward, chin against her chest, breath shallow and uneven. The thought of standing again seemed impossible, laughable, as distant as the moon above her. She let her eyes close just for a moment, just to gather strength. But what came instead was a wave of memory, the early days when it was all still new and terrifying. The first winter alone with her son, the night spent holding him close to her chest, whispering promises into his hair that she barely believed herself. The years that followed, the endless work, the missed meals, the nights when she fell asleep sitting up, her body too tired to lie down, and always, the quiet determination, tomorrow I will do better, tomorrow I will be enough. But here, on this street, under the glow of a flickering lamp, with bags torn and arms heavy and legs that no longer answered her, the word tomorrow felt like a lie. She wondered, in a small, detached part of herself, if this was what giving up looked like, not loud, not dramatic, but soft, like the fading of a song, like the slow closing of a door. She thought of her son, of the way his eyes lit up when she walked through the door, of the way he believed in her, without question, and for the first time, she felt the sharp terror of failing him, not because she didn't want to keep going, but because her body was no longer hers to command. Above her, the sky deepened into a dark, endless stretch, stars swallowed by the city's glow. She pressed her forehead to her knees, pulled the bags close, and sat in the hush of the night, listening to the sounds of a world moving on without her, waiting for her body to remember how to rise, praying that her absence would not break the small, waiting heart that still believed she would return. The cold settled deep into her bones as the minutes blurred into hours, the street lamp above flickering against the night, casting shadows that stretched and shifted around her. Slumped figure. Her body trembled under the weight of exhaustion, muscles clenched from the chill, from the ache, from the slow realization that she might not make it home tonight. But even as her body faltered, her mind clung to one unshakable image, the boy, waiting by the window, his small hands on the glass, his wide eyes scanning the empty street for the mother who had never broken her promise to return. She forced herself to lift her head, her neck stiff and burning, her face damp with sweat gone. Cold. The city had thinned to its nighttime quiet, but here and there the echo of footsteps, the occasional rattle of a bicycle chain or the hum of a passing bus still filled the space around her. With a shallow breath, she planted her palms against the ground, feeling the sting of gravel biting into her skin, and pushed once, twice, until at last she managed to lift herself to her knees. Her vision swam, the sidewalk tipping dangerously in her sight, but she stayed still until the spinning eased. When she finally staggered to her feet, her legs wobbled under the weight of her own body, and she had to lean heavily on the wall beside her just to remain upright. The bags dangled from her wrists, lighter now, barely worth the strain, but still she gripped them as if they were lifelines. The rice, what was left of it, the cracked eggs, the bruised bread, she would bring them home. She would bring something home. Step by step she moved forward, her shoes scraping against the pavement, her breath ragged and uneven. Each corner she turned brought a faint ripple of recognition. This alley, that storefront, the broken sign hanging above the corner, shop, each one marking the slow progress toward the small room that waited at the end of her journey. Her arms trembled with the effort. Her knees threatened to buckle with every step. But through it all, the thought of her son pulled her like a thread through the darkness. And then, as the last block came into view, something inside her gave way. Not the collapse of flesh or bone, but something quieter, something deeper, a surrender not of will, but of the impossible weight she had been carrying alone for too long. Her breath hitched in her throat, her chest heaving as she fought the sudden wave of tears that blurred her vision. She was not a woman prone to crying. The years had taught her to lock those things away, to bury them beneath routine and resolve. But tonight, as she staggered forward under a sky that seemed to bear down on her with all the indifference of the world, the tears came unbidden, sharp and silent, slipping down her cheeks as she gritted her teeth and kept walking. When she reached the door, the last of her strength frayed to nothing, she raised her fist to knock, not out of habit, but because her fingers could no longer fumble with the key. Before her hand could fall against the wood, the door swung open, and there he was, her boy, his eyes wide with worry, his small face pale in the dim glow of the single bulb overhead. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, frozen at the threshold between absence and return. Then his arms were around her waist, his voice muffled against her coat, his thin shoulders trembling as he buried himself in the curve of her body. She sank to her knees in the doorway, the bags tumbling. To the floor, the crushed bread and broken eggs spilling at their feet. But it didn't matter now. None of it mattered. His arms were around her, his breath warm against her skin, his voice whispering, "Mama, you're home. Mama, you're here." She wrapped her arms around him with the last of her strength, pressing her face into his hair, breathing him in, like the air she had been starving for all night. Behind them, the city moved on, the lights flickering in faraway windows, the streets humming with distant engines, the world indifferent to the quiet miracle unfolding in a doorway too small for anyone else to notice. Inside this tiny room, on this forgotten street, under this battered roof, a mother and son clung to each other as if they were all that existed, as if they were enough to hold back the night, as if in their fragile embrace lay the only answer that ever mattered. She would rise again tomorrow. She would work again tomorrow. The world would not change, the streets would remain cold, the doors would stay closed, and the faces would turn away. But tonight, in this room, with his arms wrapped tight around her and his voice soft in her ear, she allowed herself to collapse into something she had denied herself for so long. Not defeat, not surrender, but the quiet, trembling grace of simply being held.